All right, welcome back everybody. If this is your first time to the channel, welcome to Notes to Fret, where we are all about turning theory into riffs. And in this video, we're going to continue on the topic of chords, but here we're specifically going to look at chord progressions. And stick around for this one. A little bit later, I'll give you a little couple nuggets on the diminished chord, how that can work in, as well as where some of the modes that we've looked at previously kind of fit in. It'll be a very small part, but little things like that. So stick around because we'll take a look at that. But with that being said, one thing I just wanted to put out there really quick. If you go check out the website, there's a free PDF worksheet that you can download to work through some of your own chord progressions, take some notes on it, and it also gives you a chart on some of the more common popular chord progressions, as well as a diagram that kind of shows you how things work together. So go check that out. I think it'll be very helpful for you as well. But with that, let's go ahead and jump right in. And what we are going to do is we are going to look at chord progressions from an understanding of what the various functionality within the scale is really telling us, right? So here we've seen this dominant chord before, right? And dominant is all over. You'll hear dominant Phrygian, dominant chords, dominant sevenths, all over the place. And there's a reason for it. It's because of the functionality within the scale. So this will be the first part that we really start to dive into that. So what I want to do is take a look starting at the tonic, and that's the C over to the left, and take a look at the fretboard really quick. And as we move up that fretboard from our tonic all the way up to our G, you can see we have the whole step, half step, whole step. Well, that's 7 frets, and that gives us a perfect fifth, okay? We've spoken about the power chords and, everything else, and we've seen this fifth many times, but I just want to point out here, it's the perfect fifth up from the tonic, right? So we started the tonic, we start moving over to get to our fifth. That is a perfect fifth. Now, what I want to do is introduce you to the subdominant, okay? Now, looking at this to try to memorize what the subdominant is, many guitar players will just look at this and say, okay, well, it's just one whole step down from the dominant, or it's the degree in the scale before the dominant, right? Now, if you want to remember that name by looking at it in this context, okay, but that is not where the term the subdominant necessarily comes from. Where it truly comes from is if we take a look over at the octave to the far right, and we start to move up the scale, okay? Kind of going from the body to the headstock. If we look at that, going from C, now we're working back, right? Now we have a half step, a whole step, and another whole step to get to F, to the subdominant. Well, that gives us a perfect fifth back from the octave. Okay, so if we start at the tonic and move up a perfect fifth, we hit the dominant. If we start at the octave and move back a perfect fifth, we hit the subdominant. Okay, and that's where this is really coming from. Now, this is where the perfects start to really work out, and we're going to look at something else here in just a moment. Now, if we go from the octave to what the dominant is, well, let's look at that, and we see that we have a half step, a whole step, and a whole step. So we have 5 frets if we move back from the octave to the dominant, okay? Now, that is a perfect fourth, right? We know that. We have 5 frets, it's a perfect fourth. Now, if we go from the tonic to the subdominant, again, we have 5 frets, and we've moved up, once again, a perfect fourth. This is another property of perfects that we haven't necessarily spoken about, but the tonic is called the perfect unison, right? It's the same note, 1 for 1. The octave, 2 to 1, right? That's a perfect eighth, right? That's why we have the 8 above it. And then we have you can see how the perfect fourths and the perfect fifths really start to align in our scale. And this is a very crucial property. What is the perfect fifth moving up from the tonic is the perfect fourth moving back from the octave. And what the perfect fourth moving up from the tonic, i.e. C to F, is the perfect fifth when we move from the octave backwards to the subdominant, in this case back to the F, right? So this is a very important component to understand where that subdominant and dominant comes from, okay? Now, what I want to do, just keep that in mind. We'll talk specifically about the subdominant and the dominant. So if you need to go back and just kind of look at that perfect fourth, perfect fifth, that's fine. But we're gonna talk in this video about the dominant and the subdominant. So don't worry if you didn't fully capture the perfects. Just wanted to show it to you. But what I want to talk about here is chords that are stable and active. And the reason that we talk about this stable and active really kind of revolve around some of that dominant, subdominant kind of ideas, right? And don't worry if you're feeling lost right now, because we're going to dive into this and really clarify it. But this is just some of the preemptive information that we want to make certain that everybody's starting with. When we talk about stable, we're talking about chords that have a sense of, and you know, if you read this statement, have the sense of harmonic rest and allow resolutions. That kind of sounds sketchy. But what we're talking about stable is the ability to kind of come back home, right? Come back to your tonic, come back to your home, come back to C, right? That's what we call stable. If it really gives us that ability to kind of sit there and go, okay, everything's good. Now, one thing I do want to point out about stable is we're not talking about stability of a chord, right? So let's take the G major as an example, right? Which is our dominant in this case. G major sounds great. It's a very stable chord, right? So we're not talking about the quality of the G major chord. What we're talking about is the stability as it functions within the key that we are in. And the reason that that's important is because as we start to look at chord progressions, if we are not paying attention to the stability of the harmonic total of our key, things can get really out of whack, right? So when we talk about active, what we're talking about are chords that create tension within your music, right? We're talking about a musical piece. That chord create tension that wants to drive the listener back home, back to the tonic. In the case of C major, the G major is one of those chords, it's really the primary one, but that drives the listener to want to resolve back to the tonic, go back home, right? But in G major, it is the stable chord, right? So you just keep that in mind that when we're talking about these chord progressions, we're talking about the larger keys here, right? So when we're talking about stable and active, well, I've brought up tonic many times, right? And typically our tonic is our first degree. Well, it's not typically, it is our first degree. And that's our stable tonal center. When we say we're in the key of C major, C is our tonic, that's our stable center. That's what we want to keep coming back to. If we're in the key of G, it would be G, right? Now we have the subdominant. And this is the first time we start to look at what these positions in the scale really mean. The subdominant, being the fourth degree, it's an active tone, meaning it's not really your stable tone, but it's an active tone. How active, right? We'll look more at this, like how much active nature does the chord have to really force that ear to want to come back home? Well, the subdominant, it creates a mild tension to pull the user away from the tonic, right? So we've talked about needing to go back home to the tonic, but what about, getting away from it, right? Because our music has got to move. Well, the subdominant, the purpose of it is to pull the user away from that key, right? So we're home. If we just hit C all day long, we got to start moving away from it. How do we move away from it? Well, a good option is the fourth, right? We move away into that subdominant. But when we want to come back, well, if we hit that fifth just prior to the tonic, it's going to sound really good, because as soon as we hit that fifth, it's going to be like, whoa, that didn't quite, that whole progression didn't sound quite right. I'm ready to go back home now. And that's what the dominant gives us. And because the subdominant is the fourth and the dominant is the fifth, when you hear about chord progressions 1, 4, 5, and you hear it all over the place, that's why. It's the easiest chord progression on the planet. It's also one of the most used, so you're not going to really sound unique with it. But going from tonic to subdominant to dominant back to your tonic, it's going to sound good. It's going to sound musical, at least, right? So that's the purpose of the subdominant and dominant chords in the scale. Now, what I want to do is bring out something that's really called a stability chart. And when we're looking at this stability chart, we start to line up on the left some of our stable chords, and as we move over to the far right of the screen, those are some of our more active chords, right? Those, the more active, the more it wants to come back to a stable tonic. Now in here, right, there's a lot of movement. And if we look up at the scale, we'll see these half steps, right, between E and F. And then we see another half step between B and C. Those half steps are called leading tones. And I'm not going to get too terribly much into them in this video, because we kind of have to talk about some other scales. But I just wanted to kind of plant that these half steps are called leading tones, okay? I'll explain why this is relevant here. But let's take a look at how we can kind of evaluate that, right? So if we notice that the E and the F, it has that half step, and the F is pretty far over to the right, in that active stage. And then when we look at the B, there's another half step there, and that's really far over in the active stage. And so when we look at these half steps, the notes surrounding it are something that chord will resolve to very nicely. So for example, F will resolve to E very nicely, right? So if you hit that 4 out there and you're not ready to go to the dominant to come back home, you want to add some flavor, E is a really good option, right? You can kind of go, okay, that half step really lends itself to some resolution. So you can get out there with that F and kind of come back to an E. Now, you can also go from an E to an F, right? That's going to sound pretty good as well. Some people out there will say, oh my God, avoid the third like the plague. And we'll look at why they say that. I don't believe that's the case. I like bringing in the third sometimes, but hey, that doesn't mean I'm right? So in your music, you may determine that you don't like it, but regardless, we'll explore why it kind of gets that reputation. Now, the one thing here, when we look all the way out to the right and we see this diminished seventh, pretty much the way that the diminished seventh is going to get resolved is it's going to come back home. There's not really a whole lot that the 7 is going to resolve to other than the tonic. There's a little play somewhat with the A, but it's not... Just be careful when you do start doing this. Now, we've spoken many times about the diminished kind of being almost off limits, right? But if you use the diminished chord in its first inversion, it can sound a little bit better. Now, that doesn't mean go out and start jamming out with the 7th in all your majors. The diminished chord isn't like a secret formula to music or anything. It's kind of interesting to talk about, but it's regardless, first inversion or not, it's not used that much, right? But like if you did a first inversion of the 7th and then you went to D and this, which is the 2nd, and then you went to A, which is the 6th, if you try to play with that, your music, it's gonna, unless you're like writing a piece of music for like Michael Myers to pole dance to or something, just be careful. All right. So another thing that we want to look at here from the 1 to 4, right? We talked about the 1 going to the 4. That's a subdominant, right? It's a nice gentle pull. The 5 coming back to the 1. That's a really good resolution, right? And then obviously the 4 to the 5, right? The subdominant to the dominant. That's just gonna that's classic, right? Your 1 4 5. So the stability charts, and you'll find a lot of them. This is just one that I kind of favor towards, but there's others out there. I've seen where the F and the D are swapped. I've seen where the A and the G are swapped. So, you can find other stability chords or stability charts out there, and then, play with them. But we're going to look at really understanding where some of these start to get built up from. But stability charts are a great way to start really working through some of your own chord progressions. Now, right, we're talking about the tonic being the most stable. That's what we're always going to come back home to. Subdominant takes us away. Dominant brings us back home. And we're looking at this from a major perspective. And you may be thinking, well, what about a minor, right? How does that work in a minor? Well, the principles of the scale, they don't change here. There are elements of the minor scale that do change when we start talking about leading tones, but those are scales we haven't spoken about. But for our subdominant, our tonic, our octave, and our dominant, there's not a change, right? It works same for the minor. Now, there are going to be some differences within the stability chart for a minor. And, one really great reason is because in a minor, our second is diminished, right? And you can still use diminished in this first inversion if you're going to use it. But again, be careful because, it's not like a big secret. Nobody really uses diminished chords very much. They're there to give you a little bit of flavor periodically, which are cool, but just keep that in mind, right? Don't try to harp on a diminished just because I'm kind of talking about them. But here, when we're looking at that, right, that's the second. And then if we look at that E, once again, we still have that half step, right? So it's still going to resolve very nicely. But if we look at B to A, there's a whole step in there. So we'll talk about it in a minute. So you might not get quite the resolution out of that, but it's still, if you're hitting a diminished, you want to come back to your tonic. And here, right, we still go even in a minor, we can go from our 1 to our 4, right, because that's still our subdominant, to our 5, which is our dominant, and then we come back home, right? So all those features and functionality components of the scale, they work. Now I want to just kind of show something here as well. You could go 1, 4, 3, right? And it's almost a progression of stable, 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 and you gradually pull somebody away, right? And then you can go all the way out to the 7th and then come back to the 1st, right? And you can kind of see the patterns emerging, how much you want to pull away from the stable to the active, and when you come back, and you get a little bit better visual here, and you can explore a little bit more cleanly. So I want to jump back now into the major, and I want to address one of the half steps, or really both of the half steps here, kind of talking about leading tones. Now, with those half steps being the F and the B, they're kind of out there, right? And looking at this is our diatonic scale. It's all seven notes in our scale, right? Now, let's say we were kind of to go, you know what, this F is giving me a headache. If I don't deal with this F, now I'm losing my subdominant, but if I don't deal with that and I just go directly from E to G and I say, a half step plus a whole step, okay. Now, if I want to do the same thing, even though I've lost my subdominant, well, let's say that this diminished thing, and most people don't use diminished very often anyway, so I'm just going to get rid of it. And I'm just going to go directly from A to C, and I'm just going to do a whole step and a half step. So for all intents and purposes, I'm just getting rid of the problematic chords, the F and the B. Well, if anyone has ever learned the caged system, this might seem suspiciously familiar to you. And what we call it is, we don't call it the diatonic scale anymore. This is our pentatonic scale. And this is where it comes from. It's also the reason that you can hit virtually any one of these chords in virtually any order that you want, and it's going to sound musical. Just kind of come back to C periodically, and you'll be good to go. And you can solo over all of this pretty easily as well, because there's really not a whole lot that's going to sound like you've hit something really active. Almost everything is stable or quasi-stable. You don't really break out. So you can sound musical very, very quickly with the pentatonic scale and the cage system. And this is why, right? So you've lost the subdominant, lost leading tone, and it's called something else as well. But you've lost some of the creativity, some of the flavoring. But where pentatonic does come in is if you're playing with a piece of music that you want to get up and running with really, really quick, just to get something moving. Pentatonic's a great way to do it, right? You just kind of get something moving really quick. Don't have to worry about too much, and you start to get a feel, then you can explore. So that's where pentatonic comes in. It sounds musical, but it doesn't sound unique. It's been done. Now, what I want to do is really dive into the part of the video now that we kind of understand the scales and where they come from and some of the nuances in them. I want to really take a look at why we have some of the chord progressions that we actually have. We're going to be looking at the tone, but it's just tonal patterns. I'm not going to be teaching how to read music. It's just tonal patterns for information. Here, when we're looking at something called the tonic family, the tonic family can be looked at as a substitution in here. So stability charts and family can kind of conflict sometimes, and that's why you'll see variations in different stability charts. But I want to bring up this kind of family of chords so you can kind of see where it's coming from, and then you can construct your own stability charts, and you can do, then your chord progressions are yours. You'll never have to rely on a chart ever again. And so that's why I want to bring this up, right? So the first thing I want to do is take a look at our tonic family, and obviously our true tonic, our first, is our C. And this is what the C looks like musically, right? We see the stacked third patterns. The very bottom note is C, called the bass note, and then this is just our C triad. Well, we have a 6. I'll talk about the third here in a minute, but we have our 6, which is our A. And you'll notice that the A has 2 notes that are identical to our C, right? And in the A, it's that middle dot and the top dot, which align to the bottom and middle dot of our C. So we have a lot of, tonal flavoring there that's very, very similar. So could we substitute A as a tonic for a little while? You can, and we know that, first off, because A's are relative minor. So there's going to be similarities. But be careful, be very, very careful if you decide to make A your tonic, even for, a couple of bars. You can start to confuse the reader or the listener, and they think, oh, I'm in A minor, and they're not. But does it work for a bar and a bridge? Maybe, right? It could. There's nothing saying you can't. So that's why I want to bring up some of the stuff. You can start to see it now, right? Now let's bring up the third. We've already talked about how the C and the A kind of share the tonic, right? They share the same C note. But what about the third? Well, when we look at the third, which is the E in this case, it doesn't share that C at all. So how could it possibly be kind of in the tonic family? Well, it's definitely a weaker tonic, but it still shares 2 of the same exact notes that the C does, right? If you look at the middle dot and top dot of the C, it aligns to the bottom and middle dot of the E, okay? So it's a very weak tonic, but it could sound interesting, right? And you could even try it if you wanted to do the diminished in the first inversion and try to make that E your tonic. Sound interesting, but go for it. Hey, you might like it. One thing I do want to bring up with the E really quick is the third, and a lot of people are like, oh my God, do not use the third under any circumstance. Well, if we'll notice in our scale, our diminished is our B, right? And it's way out there in the active tones. It's this diminished thing. It has this half step. It's crazy. So when we talk about E, we have the E followed by the G, followed by, you guessed it, the B. And because the B is in this chord, the ear can hear it. Your listeners can hear it. And there's a good example. I'm going to leave a link in the description down below There's a short that I put together about the Dorian mode. Again, it's a short, so it's like a 2-minute video. But it talks about the tonal quality, to be able to listen to the tonal quality of the Dorian mode, which has this F sharp in it. But we use the D major to get that F sharp sound out of it, so the ear can hear it even though we don't have a direct F sharp in that chord progression. We get that F sharp from the D. Well, very similar here with the E, that B comes out. So, you know, just be careful with it. But that's why a lot of people say, oh my God, don't use the third. Well, I like it. But, you know, you choose, right? It may be something that works well for you or maybe not. The next family that I want to talk about here is the subdominant family. And the subdominant family, now we can look at the 2 and the 4, okay? Now, the subdominant, we spoke about being a chord that pulls us away from our tonic, right? It's a nice pull away rather than going back home. It pulls us away from home. And if we look at the 2 and the 4, well, we'll notice that the subdominant in the scale is an F. So our 4 is definitely our subdominant. But if we notice the similarities that the second, or in this case the D, has, we can kind of go, okay, maybe, you know, the 1 to 2, it might not be as great of a pull as a 1 to 4, but a 1 to 2 could work. And when we look at our stability chart in the middle, it's D, right? Our 2. It's kind of there, it's kind of not, kind of neutral. But here, if we look at it from a different perspective, we can start to see that maybe, you know, maybe that is a good opportunity for me to, you know, go from as opposed from 1 to 4, 1, 4, 5, which is boring, go 1, 2, 5. Who knows, right? So that's where the second kind of comes into play, and it still has an F in it, right? That's what that middle dot is with the D. Still has an F, so hey, it might sound pretty good. Maybe not quite as strong as the F because it starts with that F, but regardless, right? Now, what I want to do now is jump into the dominant family, and here we have our 5 and our 7. Our 5 is truly our dominant chord, right? And you can kind of see that the very first dot, the lowest dot in the G, aligns to the very last dot of the C, and that's what gives us that strong pullback. It has nothing to do with whether or not G major is the stable chord. We can see tonally that we have that pull, right? It's a nice alignment, but there's a whole lot that needs to get resolved there, right? Now, if we look at that 7 and we look at it from that same concept, this isn't going to make any sense at all. This doesn't share anything with the dominant, doesn't share anything with the tonic. This is just out there. It's so far out there. This B is so far out there that we don't even know where to put it hardly. But if we look at the B from a perspective of what notes are in it, it doesn't really align itself, because for that matter, the B diminished has an F in it, which is a subdominant. So it almost implies that, hey, that would be pulling me away from the tonic rather than going back home to it. But since we only have talked about the subdominant and the dominant functionality, it's going to be a little bit hard to understand why. But where it truly is coming into play isn't because of the subdominant. It's because of this half step between the B and the C, these leading tones. That's why it's such a strong pull, right? It's not because of the dominant subdominant functionality. Again, we haven't spoken a lot about this, but that's where the strong pull from the 7th back to the 1st comes from, okay? Now, again, we want to make certain that we take a look at the minor, right? How much different is it? Well, we've pretty much gone over it. There's really not a whole lot. There's, you know, some nuances with the chords. We still have the 1, right? That's our definite tonic, no question about it. Then we have our 3, right? And this, again, you got to be careful, because if you substitute the C as a temporary tonic, you just got to be careful you don't bring somebody back into the C major sound. But these both, you can see the similarities in the tonal information down there, right? So those are good for our tonic families in the minor. Now with our subdominant, little bit different, right? Now we've got the 4 and the 6. The 4 is our D, okay? And then that is our subdominant, right? That's just our 4. That's just it. Now when we look at the F, well, the F doesn't have the subdominant in it, right? Which is the D. It doesn't have it, but there's still a lot of similarities there. I mean, if we did D in first inversion, that would be pretty close to the F. So there, in the minor, maybe you go from a 1 to a 6 to a 5, as opposed to a 1 to 4 to 5, right? And you can kind of start to see and explore, now that you understand your inversions, you can start to explore that here because you can see the tonal information. Now, what I want to do here is when we look at the dominant family for the minor, I want to look at the B really quick. Now, the B, there's a point of some put the B into the subdominant family for minors. I like it in the dominant family, but that's not saying that I'm right. But when we look at the B here, there, again, we kind of wind up with a little bit of craziness, but there is a D in it. So that's, that's interesting because at least it is a subdominant. But that doesn't really, again, imply that we're going back to our tonic. It's got a subdominant in it, so it should be pulling us away. So because of that, there are some people that say that B should be a subdominant feature, meaning I should be able to go from 1 to 2 in a minor. I mean, you can, because it does have that subdominant in it. And furthermore, when we look at our tonic, which is A and B, now there's a whole step in there rather than a half step. So that resolution, you start to get some playing room in there. And because of those two together, some people will say that B belongs in the subdominant family in a minor. I'm not one of those, but hey, you might be, and there's nothing wrong with it. Like, go for it. But again, I don't want to harp so much on diminished chords because they're not that important. Now here we still have the 5 and the 7, right? So our 5 is our dominant, right? That's our E. Okay, that's just our dominant. Now, when we look at the 7, right, because E is really what we're looking at for our dominant. So how does that play into our 7th, which in this case is a G? Well, the G doesn't have the E in it, the subdominant. So what kind of resolution do we get back to the tonic with it? Well, you can see the similarities between E and G, right? And so that's where you can kind of look at that and go, okay, you know what? Maybe a 1, 6, 7, 1, that might actually work, right? Because the 6 is in the subdominant family, so that's a good progression out. And then the 7 is in the dominant family. We can see the similarities, and we can come back to our tonic. Again, with all of these, it's an opportunity for you to kind of understand how these chords work in conjunction with one another. So again, you can start putting your own chord progressions together. From all the information we've talked about, yeah, absolutely. Sometimes look at charts, but it's now you know how to put your own together, and you know why some of the chord progressions will or will not sound better. And keep in mind as well, some chord progressions have a different feel. Happy 1, 4, 5 is like ridiculously happy, but there's going to be others, right? If you tried in a minor, a 1, 6, 5, 4, 5, 1, that's going to sound a little bit, probably a little bit kind of spacey, sad, dreamy. But anyways, each one of these chord progressions has its own place. So with that, taking a look back at what we've talked about with our triads, we've talked about triads on the fretboard. We talked about the voicings, the voice leadings. We talked about inversions. In this week's, like I was saying, wasn't sure last week how this one was going to turn out, but it turned out to be chord progressions. And then looking at potentially next week for modal chord constructions. Now, one of the things I do want to point out really quick is as you're learning this, what's going to wind up happening is if you are ever working with a another guitarist or a musician that doesn't really understand this stuff, they play, oh, I got to feel it. I got to feel it. My music, I got to feel it. Well, what's going to wind up happening, and it's the most frustrating thing in the world, is you're going to be with somebody who has to feel it for like 5 hours. And then finally they come back and they're all excited and they go, oh my God, I got it. And you go, okay, what is it? And they come back with a 1-4-5 chord progression. And you're going to be like, oh my God, come on. This should have taken 5 minutes, not 5 hours. So now that you're starting to get a little bit of understanding on chord progressions, right? It gives you a good basis. Like explore for 10 minutes and then spend the next 5 hours refining something awesome rather than exploring for 5 hours to come up with, a pentatonic 1-4-5 sort of thing, or 1-3-5 or something like that. So anyways, just wanted to kind of put that out there. But as always, I know this one got a little bit long, so really, thanks for watching, everybody. There's probably a lot in here that, we went through pretty quickly, and there were some terms that I had to use, but that we hadn't necessarily gone over, like leading tones. So again, I do fall into chicken and egg problems sometimes, but thanks for hanging in there. Really appreciate you watching. And as always, let me know what you think. If you liked the video, by all means, please give me a thumbs up, because really shows me that you're liking it. And besides, it's free. Same thing with that subscribe. Smash it. That subscribe button really helps the channel out. And again, it's free. So again, thanks everybody for watching. Really appreciate it. And we will see you in the next video where we start talking about modal chords. Take care, everybody.